Hi, this is Corey Johnston, and today's lesson is going to take place in the 7th chapter in the first epistle to the Corinthians. Paul speaks of Christian approaches to the institution of marriage. The institution of marriage and family, as we know it, it is no secret, is under assault, and it has grown in viciousness and aggressiveness, seemingly with each passing day. And this is what we want to argue is that it is closely connected. One of the sexual revolution's casualties, we're going to argue today, is the American institution of marriage, and we're going to explore how it's sort of deteriorated and corrupted in relation to that by what we speak of in the 6th chapter, which leads up to where Paul speaks of sexual sin, and the lack of discipline and restraint has reaped a devastating effect on the American family, as it has been known. Verse 9, do you not know that the unrighteous shall not inherit the kingdom of Elohim? Do not be deceived, neither those who whore, nor idolaters, nor adulterers, nor effeminate, nor homosexual, nor thieves, nor greedy of gain, nor drunkards, nor revilers, nor swindlers shall inherit the kingdom of Elohim. The kingdom of Elohim is too good for these types. These types of people do not deserve to be there, so they're not going to make it, and there is no sense in singling out any one of these, such as the most memorable one, the effeminate and the homosexual. That means whether you are the passive or aggressive male counterpart in homosexual union. That's something only 3 to 5% of the population does, but what about the 61% of Christian males who regularly watch pornography? I have read polls. I don't know how they determine that, and I don't know if I want to believe that, but I do believe one of the things I've learned to do as I've spiritually matured is divorce what I wish were true from that which is not. And I really wish not that many Christians were enslaved by pornography's enslaving control. But 61% of us males, that means that it's unfair to use them as the whipping boy when so many. And now that's adultery with your eyes. The Savior elevates looking at lust with a member of the opposite sex, with the substitute of the act as the moral equivalent of the act itself. But the word whore translates as fornicate, and the lack of discipline in fornication has produced a host of evils in America. The introduction of contraception and abortion have skyrocketed the sin of fornication. Formerly, the practice was to wait until you got married, but now the rule seems to be graduate high school, not a virgin. So the consequences for the church not addressing this issue is that the culture takes over and they define sex, and that leads to nowhere good. But the other sins on here, we're not going to emphasize it, but, drunkards, that's something I personally struggled with. So it would be wrong of me to read too much. I'm not worried about the sexual sins. Adultery is one of the things that most Christians never did or even contemplates. They like to point the finger. It's a serious, but I'm not condoning it, but it is just a sin. None of these sins are necessarily any more grievous than any other, but the sin of unbelief. So a lot of Christians struggle with the fact that homosexual activity is a sin, but that's one of the things we have to accept by faith. We can count the number of times that the Bible references the practice on 1 or 2 fingers, and they are each invariably negative. So it would be more sinful for me to think that it is not a sin than to personally indulge therein, I guess is what I'm trying to say. Verse 11, and such were some of you, but you were washed, but you were made sacred, and you were justified in the name of the Master Yahshua, and by the Spirit of our Elohim. So they were forgiven. They were formerly indulgers. They knew these things. They were these things. They did these things. To Corinth, to be a Corinthian was a pejorative term in the ancient world. It would have been a fornicator. So they were no strangers, and they are no strangers. Our culture is hypersexual. They would have been right at home. We are a Corinthian society. But they've been forgiven. They've been washed under the rug through the name and the power of the one, the Master, and the Spirit has a stirring contribution. He's an added ingredient in that part. And he also speaks in verse 15, do you not know your bodies are members of Messiah? Shall I then take the members of Messiah and make them members of a whore? Let it not be. So the members of Messiah means that our bodies are not our own. When we belong to the body of the Messiah, we liken it, Paul does in the 12th chapter, to a body and the different interlap and interplay of our spiritual giftedness in these various locations, likening it to an organism which functions and moves throughout the real world. But our bodies are the temple, and they do not belong to us. So it is not for us to pick and choose to gratify ourselves sexually when the immediate gratification opportunity comes. We obey the law of chastity. No, one man, one woman, and that alone, and anything outside of that is rebellion. But you cannot enjoin your members to whores if you belong to him, because that is something that Christians do not do. That is part of the old life. That is part of the pagan culture. That is part of the Gentile. Flee whoring. Every sin that a man does is outside the body, but he who commits whoring sins against his own body. Get away, flee, get out of there before it gets there, anticipate it in advance, and just have the courage to walk away when a seductive situation, because every sin, now the sexual sin confuses a lot of people, because the argument is I'm only hurting myself, and but you are hurting the one who gave you the body that you abuse and defile through your perverted lust and selfish peccadillos. Just get away from it, flee, look the other way, turn away, don't put yourself there to begin with. Or do you not know that your body is the temple of the Ruach Kadesh, who is in you, who you have Elohim, and you are not your own? Once more, the life that you have is not your own. The bodies that you have do not belong to you. Your spirits are surrendered, and your bodies belong to him too. You are the temple. That means you must not defile or pollute the temple, the sacred confines, with sin or anything else. Sexual sin, which defiles the body, defiles the soul, defiles the spirit, and degrades and diminishes and grieves the Spirit working in us and through us. So when we become the temple, we have duties and obligations and expectations to meet, to satisfy that in its full calling. For you are bought with a price, therefore esteem Elohim with your body and in your spirit, which are of Elohim. The division and the dichotomy between body and spirit is largely an artificial construct. The Christian does not observe the body to be evil, although it does have evil potential. In the spirit, there are certainly evil spirits. But all things, all elements of our existence, all elements of our natures are subordinate to him. We are yoked to him, and he bought us with a price. Salvation is free, but it was not cheap. God had to send his only begotten Son at great personal price in order that we might be saved. If there was any other way, he wouldn't have done it, but we were bought with a price because we are valuable. So verse 1, 7th chapter, 1 Corinthians. And concerning that which you wrote to me, it is good for a man not to touch a woman. This is a narrative division where Paul henceforth answers questions that were communicated to him via epistle. So the teaching by epistle is a novel New Testament way of communicating sacred doctrine and spirit-saturated writings, and the necessity was the mother of this invention. So they had questions about marriage, and he told them that it is good for a man not to touch a woman. It is not necessarily bad. It is bad when a man touches a woman outside the acceptable and established parameters of Elohim. But he desired. Now Paul was personally celibate. He never married, and but who is he to lay down? And the answer is he is the receptacle of who is he to lay down the law for man and wife, an arrangement that he himself never went in. And the answer is he was a receptacle of the sacred revelation. But he's not imposing his own Spartan standards. Paul was celibate. Paul never took a dime for preaching, but he was realistic enough to recognize. In fact, he recognizes in the latter-day heresies that which were upon him as he spoke, that some will come forbidding marriage, and this was true with the Catholic Church and various heretical sects throughout the centuries. But because of whoring, let each one have his own wife, and let each woman have her own husband. You're not going to get rid of the sexual impulse that does not go away once you get born again, but rather than invest our lust in any direction, let us have one source of satisfaction. That is what a wife and a husband exist for mutual sexual satisfaction. There is more than sex, but he's talking about whoring in mind. And lust is the counterfeit of love. So lust has enough of the properties of love to convince one who is smitten of its spirit that it is the authentic article. But he's talking about love, which goes above and beyond getting your rocks off. So one of the purposes of marriage is sex for children and procreation. Let the husband render to his wife what is her due, and likewise also the wife to her husband. In a mutually fulfilling capacity, they both have needs, wants, and desires that must be satisfied with the other. There are definite gender roles. God designed each gender to do certain things and perform certain functions and to play various roles that the other gender is not capable of doing. A man cannot bear a child. A woman can only do that, but, we do our part for what we can. It takes a father to raise a man, and one of the consequences of not having a father in the home is that children without fatherly influences at home are statistically proven to be more violent and criminally inclined. The wife does not have authority over her own body, but her husband does. And likewise, the husband does not have authority over his own body, but the wife does. So they are mutually submitted, not to themselves, but to each other. But they both cede to their own mastery. They both enter into a voluntary arrangement where their bodies are not their own. They become the one. This is why two become one in the Edenic formula of Genesis 2:24. So what belongs to us belongs to them, and it is now our bodies are already submitted. They are already temples of the Ruach Kodesh, and they are already members of Messiah, but now they also belong to a significant other to complete us, and we share it with them, and they share their bodies with us. Verse 5, do not deprive one another except with agreement for a time, to give yourselves to fasting and prayer, and come together again, so that Satan does not try you because you lack of self-control. So this practice of voluntarily entering into a determined time of sexual abstinence to increase their devotional life, to fast and pray with renewed intensity and without the distraction of marital love, Paul was not against that, but he exercised caution in doing it. Do not enter into any contest that you are not equipped to emerge unscathed from. So Satan is out there, and he was trying to trip up a lot of newlyweds. Satan hates the institution of marriage, and behind the assault which of the American family, nuclear family institution of family that has been known, it is the architect is Satan and the animators are demon. There is demonic forces at work trying to trip up and to trap and to destroy. They're not trying to redefine marriage. That's the first pretext. That's the cannon fodder, but they're trying to destroy it altogether. And marriage is the institution which God designed to impart values and instructions and an education for civil order, for societies of common grace. And when we are in blatant rebellion against God right now, in the Supreme Court allowing same-sex marriage to work its way and to just slowly deracinate. It's a degenerate step towards the destruction of the American family, as it has been known. But the lack of self-control now, a lot of horny young people could not honor the interval which they had agreed to with their spouse. So that was a time when Satan got busy, and they could not control themselves. So he just wanted them to pay attention, be mindful, be on guard, be alert, because your adversary, Satan, walketh around like a roaring lion seeking whom he may devour. He is always busy, and he is busy right now. He is doing, he's just coming at this generation in an unprecedented way. His attacks have increased exponentially, seemingly, in my lifetime. And I say this as a concession and not as a command. Paul is clear to differentiate at various points throughout his epistles what he distinguishes between a commandment, a direct revelation, and a concession that is something else. So he's letting him know he's giving them through this. He is not commanding, and he is willing to compromise somewhat from the commandment. For I prefer that all men were even as I myself, but each one has its own gift from Elohim, one in this way and another in that. Paul was uniquely gifted for ministry, and he was married to his work, so it was part of God's will and God's design that Paul remain a bachelor from start to finish in order that he could yield these fantastic evangelical harvest. And Paul, if it was up to him, he would have every man be as he was, just be a bachelor and not even marry. But he recognized that others had needs, wants, interest, and the will of God is never identical from teacher to student. So Paul was realistic to recognize that the institution of marriage is God ordained, worthy of preserving, worthy of protecting, worthy of fulfilling, worthy of honoring, and worthy of perpetuating in its pristine form. And I say to the unmarried and to the widows, it is good for them if they remain even as I am. So the temptation for the young, now there were grades and differentiations between widows because remember the ancients had a higher mortality rate than we do, so it was not uncommon for widows to be in the 30-year-old category and the 60-year-old category. And but the unmarried would have been around the same age as the younger widows. These are the ones at the peak of their sexual energy. And better for them, as he concedes, this is the concession that he said that he speaks of earlier, that marriage is a legitimate alternative to burning with lust, as he makes plain in the 9th verse. But if they do not have self-control, let them marry, for it is better to marry than to burn. Burn is to burn in lust. Remember, lust is the deviant perversion of counterfeit, cheap imitation, satanic knockoff of love, and this the lust is just the physical attraction to someone of the opposite sex. You can lust for money, you can lust for women, you can lust for all sorts of things, but lust creates it creates an itch that doesn't satisfy. It has to keep going, and you seek the gratification and immediate gratification, but it offers no long-term satisfaction. So better than you to be governed every which way by your uncontrollable sexual impulses, desires, better to domesticate that. So family has a domesticating life which prevents the male from spreading his oats everywhere which way he would like. And to the married I command, not I, but the master, a wife should not separate from a husband. So he is clear to differentiate that this commandment is a direct revelation, it's a direct order, and a direct word from the master himself, with whom Paul was uniquely communion with. He was entrusted. He spoke to him eye to eye and ear to ear, and the master told him to tell the Corinthians that divorce is an abomination. Let no man divide asunder what Elohim has joined together, as he himself said. So divorce is an evil, and it's a wicked, and it's a tragedy, and it's a travesty, and the divorce rate is off the charts, and the fact that we are divorcing at alarming rates is giving the homosexuals license and pretext to experiment with their bizarre, corrupt, degraded, degenerate form of the family all across in all 50 states, protected by the Supreme Court, the ruling. And to the married I command, not I, but the master, a wife should not separate from a husband. Already read that. But if she is indeed separated, let he remain unmarried or be restored to favor with her husband, and let a husband not send away a wife. So marriage's difficulty and the temptation to throw in the towel is perhaps omnipresent, more intensely so in some relationships than others. But Paul says at least try to reconcile. Do not give up if you have entered into this sacred union. Don't enter into it haphazardly. Make sure you enter into one with you are prepared to invest lifetime with, and not just to get your rocks off that day and tomorrow. But try and make it work. Seek amends, make amends, ask for forgiveness. The living with someone else, you can't get away with some of the things you could, and your sins do find you out. So forgiveness is a necessary virtue to cultivate between married couples. And the rest I say, not the master. If any brother has an unbelieving wife, and she thinks well to live with him, let him not send her away. So the problem now, with this problem in mind, that many of those who came to the Messiah had already entered into wedding arrangements, and their spouses remained Gentile pagan unbelievers and infidels. And Paul says, with this development in mind, if you are a Christian now and you are single, marry Christian. But, divorce is a sin against God. So at least try and work your influence in your home, because one of the designs of marriage is children, so that your children can catch your faith, even if your significant other does not. And a woman who has an unbelieving husband and he thinks well to live with her, let her not send him away. So what's true for Christian women is true for Christian men, and vice versa, and 100 times over. So the standard is parallel. Do not let the fact that you are already married and you became a Christian after you were married, do not let that disrupt or stimulate a divorce in that relationship, but remain wedded as you were, remain as you were, as you are when you came to the Messiah, and remain in that indefinitely. For the unbelieving husband has been sacred in the wife, and the unbelieving wife has been sacred in the husband. Otherwise your children would be unclean, but now they are sacred. So it's an abnormal admixture. What fellowship hath light with darkness, with righteousness, with unrighteousness? 2 Corinthians 6:14. So that we are discouraged from entering into marriage arrangements with those who do not share the faith. And one of the benefits of having no choice but to remain in such a relationship is your children are declared that they have the materials and they have the access and they have the influence to live godly life. So marriage is the God-ordained means through which we transmit values and culture and civilization and everything else. So marriage is all about the children. And if you're a Christian now, don't marry outside the faith. What is true for them is true for them. But the fact is, whether you became a Christian and you are married, remain wedded to your wife. Do not discard her. Do not divorce her. Do not do any of that. And if the unbelieving one separates, let him separate himself, a brother or a sister who has not been enslaved in such matters. But Elohim has called us to peace. So Paul proposes a rather liberal attitude in this divorce. If the unbelieving one separates, let bygones be bygones. This message will divide, and if they cannot handle the heat, then they best get out of the kitchen. So farewell, good riddance. Divorce is not the end of the world in such a scenario. It is a last resort, but it is one that is justified in such the case that the unbelieving husband voluntarily or unbelieving wife voluntarily divorces from them. Do not resist it. Do not contest it. Do not become enslaved to them, because your union, your marriage bond, when you join the church, you are the bride of the Messiah. So let that remain intact and let that remain impure, and remember that you are called to peace, and there is seldom peace in divorce. But there is in fully functioning marital union that is flourishing as God intended and as God designed it, and that can only exist and flourish between two individuals who sincerely love each other and love the Father. For how do you know, O wife, whether you shall save your husband? Or how do you know, O husband, whether you shall save your wife? There is no such thing as a vicarious salvation. You are not saved by the proxy of your believing spouse. You are saved by your individual response to the message that your spouse lived by. So they are not exempt. They have the access to the influence, and they will be judged more accordingly, living in a home where one person is a Bible believer and a good news proclaimer. They're going to have the opportunity. So he's not expecting a conversion right away, but he is hoping for one of the consequential blessings of having remaining wedded to a spouse in such situation is that there is theoretically unlimited redemptive potential in even the most reprobate pre-reprobate. Only as Elohim has distributed to each one, as the Master has called each one, so let him walk. And so I order in all the assemblies. This is binding. This is not all applicable to only the Corinthians. This is Paul is exercising his apostolic authority here. Now, a lot of the things that he said in situational context have been imposed as universal prescriptions erroneously, such as, for instance, his command to suffer not a woman to teach or exercise authority over a man. That was a sensitive situation with Timothy. The women in Ephesus were just not ready. They did not have the maturity to do that office. But what he says here is remain as you are and stay as you are, whether you're married. Continue in that if you are married to an unbeliever, but don't tie yourself up with an unbeliever once you become a Christian. If you are single and unmarried, find a Christian spouse. Was anyone called while circumcised? Let him not become uncircumcised. Was anyone called while uncircumcised? Let him not be circumcised. So there was a physical process and procedure where a Gentile or a Jew could uncircumcise himself, but that Paul's saying that's just not necessary. Don't even circumcise yourself, which would have been a lot more simple than the uncircumcision process. And the issue and item was a hot button controversy. It caused a lot of confusion, certainly in the early, when it remained wedded to its Jewish roots, and circumcision was a source of pride to the Jewish people. So a lot of the early Jewish Christian believers had difficulty detaching themselves from that. But Paul once more demolishes its significance into insignificance. Let him remain as you are. The circumcision is not, and the uncircumcision is not, but keeping the commandments of Yahweh. So there's a higher principle at operation and at work here than the question of circumcision. The necessity of it was settled and quashed at the Jerusalem assembly, of which we read of in Acts 15. Circumcision was no longer necessary, but these things, these new commandments, these marriage principles and guidelines are binding commandments. He says so with the words, all the assemblies in 17, and they remain the standard guideline and boundaries, and sets the guidelines and expectations of marriage, which is under assault at an alarming rate. So many forces from so many angles, cultural, market, the schools, the academic, the Hollywood, just all these forces are combining to conspire to wipe out the family, as it would be known. And what can we do? We can govern our own sexual desires in the 6th chapter to preserve the institution of marriage as God designed it, as God ordained it, and that is one worthy of all preservation. That's all the time we have for today. Thank you so much. I'm so glad you're here. Stay tuned until next time. I'll see you then. Bye-bye.